Hello, welcome. I'm Rabbi Sarah Mulhern, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the first of this year's series of holiday webinars for rabbis. Before we begin, I want to urge you to take full advantage of the Shalom Hartman Institute's other rabbinic learning and teaching support resources, including more of these holiday webinars for rabbis, as well as our newly released Leader's Guide and source sheet packets to support you in facilitating learning in your community based on Yossi Klein Halevi's newly released Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. And with that, I'll turn it over for learning with the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for all of the work that you're doing to support rabbis in advance of the high holidays and in general. And thanks to my colleagues here at the Institute, Sabra Waxman and others for making this webinar today possible. What I want to study with you together today is the question of what it really means to be in community with those who we think are wrong. There are constant areas in which this question manifests in our society. Obviously, questions of political pluralism, questions of religious pluralism, which have been enduring questions for the Hartman Institute for decades. But I want to dig in the religious and the spiritual sense to the deepest version of this. What does it really mean to be in community, not just with people who we disagree with, who we have, value-neutral types of disagreements with, but people who we actually think are truly wrong and who are stuck in their ways, people who are iniquitous, people who are sinners. And to do this, I wanted to study together with you, or I want to jump off of what I think is my favorite line in all of Jewish liturgy, but certainly my favorite line in the High Holiday liturgy, one that I think gets passed over quite quickly because if you come 3 minutes late to Kol Nidre, you'll miss it, and who hasn't been there? And also it just liturgically winds up sounding like a preconditioned statement before the much more dramatic performance of the Kol Nidre itself, but is an incredibly loaded little line, which we say almost like a throwaway, but which I think actually has a tremendous amount of truth in it, and even radical truth about the meaning of community. And the line is, Al da'at ha'kahal ve'al da'at ha'makom. In some versions, it's reversed, Al da'at ha'makom ve'al da'at ha'kahal, anu matirin lehitpalel im ha'avaryanim. With the knowledge of the congregation and with the knowledge of God, what really also means with permission of God or permission of the congregation, we grant permission to pray with the avaryanim, with the sinners, or if you prefer, with the boundary crossers, if you want to be a little bit more midrashic with the language of avaryanim. It's an incredibly weird line for a lot of reasons, and if that was our only text for the purpose of today, we would have enough to do. What does it mean for a congregation to say al da'at ha'makom? Like, in what ways do we grant ourselves permission to say with God's knowledge, or as if to say with God's permission we're doing something? I get for us to say al da'at ha'kahal, we collectively give ourselves permission to pray with sinners, but there's something remarkable about saying, no, it's not just us giving ourselves permission to doing this, God also grants us permission. And who decides that God has granted us permission to do that is an extraordinary thing. And then the line itself, anu matirin lehitpalel im ha'avaryanim, we grant permission to pray with the sinners. And what's strange about it is that there doesn't seem to be a direct object to the verb of matirin. To whom are we granting permission to pray with the sinners? And the colloquial rendering of the line would be, we grant ourselves permission to constitute a community of people in which sinners are present. It's still a strange verbal construction, and it sounds as though it's not clear that we're giving ourselves permission, or is it the leaders of the congregation giving permission to others to pray with sinners? It would seem more logical to say, anu matirin la'atzmeinu, we give ourselves permission, or we permit sinners to be in the room. But there's something else happening here. And I want to focus on the middle piece, which is the verbal construct, lehitpalel im. We want to give ourselves, or we want to give this congregation permission to pray together with sinners. What's amazing about this line, lehitpalel im ha'avaryanim, is that what we're not merely saying is we give permission for sinners to be in the room. What we're saying is we give ourselves permission to actually enact a version of religious sincerity, to pray with sinners that incorporates together with you people in the room who you see as religious violators. In other words, we're not merely saying, I'm praying and I tolerate the fact that Goldberg in the aisle down from me is obviously not praying, is obviously doing whatever Goldberg does that embeds him in the category of sinner, but that I'm actually incorporating this person and their sins together with me in the same ritual act of prayer, that we are a community of prayer together with people who we see to be sinners. What's amazing about this, there's a lot of things that are extraordinary about it, what it means about prayer, what it means to have a prayer community together with people who you see as sinners. But the context is also kind of amazing. This takes place right before Kol Nidre. Now, the Kol Nidre liturgy itself ostensibly is an act of hatarat nidarim, exonerating people out of their vows. And one of the things that's supposed to happen when you exonerate people out of their vows is that everybody ostensibly goes until Kol Nidre no longer in the category of sinners, because sin is one of the implied vows. Right? A person who did something wrong in the past, maybe continually did something wrong, is thought of as though they had taken a kind of implied vow to do bad things in the world. And Kol Nidre kind of lets everybody off the hook. You're no longer wedded to the norms and ways that you've inherited from the past. You're now kind of a new person and a fresh start. And so it would be strange to say, why do I then give myself permission to pray with sinners if I'm about to say a piece of liturgy in which I'm basically saying that nobody has this category, enduring category of sinners, unless I actually am supposed to believe that they do, that they actually remain in the category of being sinners in spite of the Kol Nidre itself. Kol Nidre may be insufficient to dislodge people from their sinfulness. It might be actually that people remain sinners in spite of Kol Nidre, and therefore I have to do this extraordinary statement at the beginning of the liturgy of you're going to have to be here together with people who you think are not just wrong but possibly evil. It might imply, even further than that the people in the room are not just participants whose presence we are excusing. That's just saying, I want to be able to acknowledge you're here because I don't want to get in the way of the distraction of the prayer that I'm about to do. But maybe it acknowledges that those who are in the room actually shape what the kahal is, that the congregation is actually shaped by the presence of these sinners. We give ourselves permission to pray in an environment that is somewhat tainted. Or possibly, I'll just say this suggestively, we can spend a lot more time on it, from a Kol Nidre perspective, if the act of Kol Nidre is hatarat nidarim, releasing ourselves from our vows, and we're about to undertake a process of collectively releasing ourselves from our vows, then maybe the other individuals in the room are actually not just people who are praying with us, but they're effectively fellow judges in the process of hatarat nidarim, which means I'm not merely giving myself permission to pray with sinners, but I'm actually giving ourselves permission to constitute a beit din, to constitute a court, together with people who are sinners, which I would think would be even more problematic. Now, there are endless contemporary examples that I'm sure you all as rabbis and as prayer leaders in your community can be thinking about of like, who do you have in mind? Who are the people who constitute the avaryanim who we imagine we're trying to avoid? There are many to think about. You could map this into questions of building community around political pluralism. I'm interested a little bit more in faith, but I'll give one example, and it's a really loaded one. So just a little warning. I remember a number of years ago, I was in a synagogue for high holidays, and there was a member of the congregation who was a convicted sex offender. And everybody knew about it. It was like, because it had been a very public, terrible story. And I remember sitting at Shabbat meals with people who were scandalized and upset about the idea of being in community in general with this person. And there are all sorts of caveats that make that anxiety legitimate. Is it safe for your children to be in the community with this person? Is it safe to imagine that this person has actually simply been punished for what they did and now is just another person? Or are they entrenched in their own criminal misbehaviors? But there was a piece of me when I heard this that went back to this verse and said, part of the bigger ask that Anu Matirin Lehitpalel Im Havaryanim is making of us is not just can I focus with this person around, and not just would I prefer to not be in religious or spiritual or prayer communities with people who I think are really have really done bad things, but is my community compromised? And in that way, maybe the text is saying to us, no, there's no such thing as a community that's compromised. You have to do the work at the outset of figuring out how do you make it possible to pray in an environment like this. Now, obviously, most examples of avaryanim, which in modern Hebrew now means criminals, are not as transparent or as obvious as this particularly crude one. But in the present moment that we're in which there is a growing hyper-awareness of iniquity in our communities, our institutions, etc., and a culture of calling out that iniquity, our institutions, what does it mean to then constitute religious and spiritual community together with the individuals who have been called out for their iniquity? The framework I want to think about, as is the subtitle of today's webinar, Religious Pluralism Revisited, is once again pluralism, as I said, an enduring question for the Institute and one that never seems to go away, in part because it just seems as though the playing fields in the modern world shift. So sometimes the issues that we have to negotiate around pluralism are around religious or spiritual or denominational difference, and sometimes they are around political difference. But it has remained throughout the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, the reality that human beings simply don't know how to get along. And our tradition and its insistence, and I think this is one of the things that the Institute has advocated for a long time, our tradition's insistence on the idea of pluralism, multiple truths coexisting, has been one of our radical ideas for a long time and persists. One of the thinkers that I want to use to help frame this discussion, I think the clearest thinkers about pluralism as a modern political ethos is Isaiah Berlin, and it's the first text in your source sheet. And just looking briefly at the end of the excerpt that I gave you, it's from an essay called Two Concepts of Liberty. The timing is significant. The essay comes out in 1958. Berlin's main idea that he teaches as the driver for pluralism is inspired in many ways by the end of the Second World War. The argument that the single most dangerous feature of the modern experience has been the idea of single truths and what people will do to preserve the legitimacy of their single truths over others. And he identifies both fascism and the rise of communism in the 20th century as the consequences of being wedded to single notions of truth. In our context, however, I'm a little less interested in the overt political message that Berlin is saying. But he makes reference on page 32, which is right at the end of the first essay in your sources. He talks about, he says, there's little need to stress the fact that monism and faith in a single criterion has always proved a deep source of satisfaction both to the intellect and the emotions, and pluralism is his response. And part of the reason I'm drawn to this here is that what Berlin is alluding to is something that people who are connected to religion and to faith know very well, which is that religious sincerity and conviction seem to correlate very much with this idea of monism, one single truth. It's very hard to imagine what it means to be a person of deep faith who doesn't believe that the things that they are doing, because you believe that they're true, mean that people who are violating them are sinners. And almost inevitably, a person of faith is going to divide the world, almost inevitably, between those who are adherents to the true and correct faith and those who are rejecting it. And as a result, one of the consequences of religious community is a need to constantly differentiate, almost in an obligatory way, constantly differentiate between, if not the sinner and the saint, at least the sinners and the non-sinners. You know, we may not say that we're saints, but there is a anu, the we, and there is the avaryanim. And it's very difficult to try to actually live in religious community together with those who are not doing what is right. It almost seems to be that religious community, together with sinners, undermines the sincerity of a collective religious experience. If we are all doing what we're supposed to be doing, if we're all experiencing a certain type of piety, or even more than that, if we are the people who are constituting the foundation of good behavior around which religious sincerity can live out in the world, somebody else in the room who doesn't buy into that core set of convictions makes us seem as though we're performing something that's illegitimate. It's really quite difficult to build religious community across difference. As hard as it is to build political community across difference, oftentimes, at least political community, you know that you're talking about strategies, and you can oftentimes agree about moral convictions. Well, we both see the world, we both want the same basic outcomes, but we have different political strategies. But religion, passionate beliefs, oftentimes make us believe that sincerity, which is a corollary of conviction, can be the opposite of pluralism. The psychology of how this happens, of disqualification, why a person who is sincere, committed to what they're about, and therefore doesn't want to sit together with other people who don't share those views, the psychology of disqualification is really quite strong. And here, just as to build the strength of why this is difficult, I'm pointing you to the next sources on the source sheet from Bavli Sanhedrin, and then the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah, talking about what it means to build a court in which there is difference of opinion in that court. I want to just briefly show in the Gemara, based on the Mishnah, is trying to work through how do you actually build a fair court. If one litigant comes and says, I want to have, I believe that this would be a fair court for me, and another litigant comes and wants to have a different court, how do you create a conditions by which the court is fair? And through an extensive halachic argument, ultimately the Gemara concludes that the way in which this would work is not that each litigant chooses one court, but that each litigant can choose a judge, and then the second litigant chooses a judge, and then those two judges together pick the third judge, and that will ultimately make for a fair fight. The assumption, essentially, of the Talmud is that in the context of a court system, you don't disqualify on. You just start with building a decent system. You're not really interrogating who's good and who's bad, but something positively, communally can emerge just on the basis of individual choice. But what's remarkable is by the time you get to the halacha about this in the Rambam, talking about judges' willingness to sit with other people, we start to see the emergence of a culture of disqualification. The culture of disqualification is what I'm going to notice as operating, is what prompts anu matirim lehitpalel im avaryanim. That is the instinct of why you shouldn't be allowed to pray with sinners. And you can find it as a culture of disqualification in these two halachot in the Rambam on pages 6 and 7 of your sources. The first says, Dayan shehu yodeh b'chavero shehu gazlan o rasha. If a judge knows about a fellow judge that he is a thief or a wicked person, asur lehitztaref imo. Shenamar, he can't actually sit in a court with that person. Shenamar midvar sheker tirchak, which the Rambam is reading very literally. You actually have to distance yourself from not just an object of falsehood, not just a piece of falsehood, but a person who embodies it. And then an amazing anecdote. V'kach hayu nikiyei hadat sheb'Yerushalayim. I love that phrase, nikiyei hadat. The people who are clean-minded, the good, so to speak. Kach hayu osin, ein yoshvin badin. They wouldn't sit together in judgment. Ad sheyedu im min hem yoshvim. They wouldn't sit unless they knew who they were sitting with. V'lo chotmin et hashtar ad sheyedu mi chotem imahem. They would not sign official legal documents until they knew who were the co-signers. And this is where it gets pretty dark. V'lo nichnasim leseuda ad sheyedu mi mesev imahem. Nor would they sit at table unless they knew exactly who was sitting with them. I recognize this. This is the religious sincerity, or even the political sincerity of, I will not join in judgment if I consider my fellow judges to be illegitimate. But the reason I suggest that it's dark is that it moves very quickly from the realm of justice, which is where I would say, well, maybe that's legitimate. If you feel that your fellow judge is corrupt, then it would be compromising to you to sit in judgment with that person. But when it shifts from court to table, well, now I'm in the business of the kind of litmus testing that makes almost any political or religious community unimaginable. The minute that I can start evaluating, I will not enter into this room and sit at this table until, it doesn't even say, they wouldn't sit at table unless they were able to confirm that the people were good. They needed to know who was in the room, and all of the judgment of good and evil winds up being on those individuals. The possibility of constructing community on the basis of that kind of standard is really quite difficult. And as a result, that's where I see like the precipitating problem that we're going to have to deal with a phrase like this. The Rambam goes even further in the following chapter where he says, Kol shnei talmidei chachamim sheson'in ze et ze, asurin le'shev badin ze im ze. If two sages, so it's not one judge and one person who I don't know yet, but both of them are actually described as Talmidei Chachamim. Both of them are described as scholars or as sages, but if they detest each other, they're not permitted to sit in the same court together. Shedavar ze gorem litziat mishpat me'ukal. The fact that they hate each other perverts justice. Why? Mipnei shehasin'ah shebenehem, the hatred between them, dat kol echad noten listor divrei chavero. The more that I hate you, I'm going to simply play a kind of devil's advocate and simply refute your side of things. And then I'm not talking about justice, I'm merely playing out some sort of vengeance against my fellow judge. And here too, this is not quite, the first piece that we saw in the Rambam is about, I know that you're wicked. And here it's not really about wickedness anymore. It's just about, I don't want to be in the same room together with you. And here again, I can imagine in the context of prayer, if I'm sitting on the, next to somebody in shul who I don't like, I can imagine all sorts of perverse incentives on how I daven, how I pray, where my attention goes, that is not driven by being in the same space, but is actually responding negatively to those who are around us, the negative energy of those who are in the room. And it would be hard-pressed for me to imagine a rabbi who doesn't struggle with this, who doesn't stand up at the bima and sees somebody in shul and it's distracting and hard. And in part because they may have done something to you or you may have done something to them. I know it's hard for Baalei Tefillah, people who are responsible for leading prayer communities, to actually represent the totality of what's going on in the room, as difficult as it is for a congregant, if they're angry at the rabbi, to sit there and actually have to be engaged in religious and spiritual community together with these people. So this is but what's extraordinary, part of what on the table here is the Rambam is almost like the moral preconditions before we even get to the prayer that we're talking about. And he indicates, don't be on a court together with people you don't like. Don't be in a court together with judges who you think are evil. Like, that's actually normal. What Kol Nidre demands of us, anu matirin lehitpalel im avaryanim, is actually is a threshold that's higher than halacha, right? That's something obvious morally about the conditions that the Rambam's creating. Now, you might argue, well, a prayer community is different than a court. But then again, this is taking place at Yom Kippur, which, as we know, is Yom Hadin. It's taking place at Kol Nidre, which is a moment of a court-like community. So the standard that's being played out by the sentence, anu matirim lehitpalel im avaryanim, seems to be a higher threshold than what we usually use as the rules for the court system. And moreover, you might even argue beyond that if civil court, as the Rambam is indicating, demands a kind of threshold of moral purity, shouldn't religious community have a higher threshold for moral purity than the civil court system? Shouldn't when you're standing in front of God in an act of prayer, shouldn't that be the place where you should be really cautious not to be praying together with people who are sinners, who could be undermining the collective religious experience that you're supposed to be a part of? So even if it's not a perfect analogy of what Maimonides is doing relative to this prayer that we're studying, it does seem to create conditions where I would think that the psychology of disqualification should be a lot stronger than what we're being asked to do when it comes to this prayer. So I want to suggest three logical possibilities then for why this prayer, why we want it in face of the obvious reasons for why we wouldn't, and what we might be able to take away from it. The first possibility, which I'm not going to dig into at all, I'm actually not going to deal with the first two. We'll spend all our time on the third. The first possibility is this is a kind of coded way of saying we are all avaryanim. We are all sinners. We're not really saying anu matirim lehitpalelim avaryanim, that there's some sort of difference between we and the sinners who are in the room. But rather, we imagine that we are all collectively avaryanim, and we're essentially giving ourselves permission to enter into this room. That feels like nice, but it actually, I could find another way to say that. Since we are all, the same way that we know, we have versions like this in prayer. Afilu kulanu chachamim u'demonim, the more positive version of that we say in the Haggadah, is like we know that we don't really have to do this, but we do it. I can imagine a way of saying, we know that we're all avaryanim, and yet we're entering into this religious experience together in order to be able to exonerate ourselves of our sins. The fact that there is a distinction between the anu and the thems is suggestive of something that has to be more than that. The second possibility is the begrudging possibility. There is an us and there is the them. We are the non-avaryanim and they are avaryanim, but we are kind of paternalistically allowing them to sit in our community. This is probably the historical antecedent of this prayer. Folks have written about this. The text was itself probably written in reference to conversos who had returned to the community. And you had to find, it was essentially like a political licensing, probably for the people in the room who were like, why are those people allowed back in? For the community leaders to get up and say, no, we actually want them back in Jewish community, and we're giving them permission to be back here. In other words, it clarifies something of a political position that still preserves a difference between us who are basically good and them who are bad, and all of the burden really on repentance sits on them. Like we're giving them permission to be here. We feel like it's a little bit compromising that we're allowing them here, but hopefully they'll do the work they need to do in order to justify retroactively the decisions that we've made. From a kind of positive historical perspective, knowing where the text came from could be sufficient. Okay, well, that's where it came from. From the kind of spirituality of Torah perspective, even if that's true, most people who have said it throughout history have said it not knowing that that's what it referenced. And so the fact that it persists in the Machzor demands of us to think beyond simply the historical context by which the prayer is created. And that's what I want to suggest as a more radical third possibility of what this text could mean for us, which is that community requires avaryanim. That's not merely anu matirin lehitpalelim avaryanim. We know they're bad, we know that we're good and we're giving them permission, but that actually we are matirin. We are making permissible that a community should be constituted, a community of prayer should be constituted of and with people who are sinners. I want to offer a couple of texts that help us think about why. Why would it be necessary for religious community to not just tolerate sinners in our midst, but in some way become strengthened by the presence of sinners in our midst? So I think one possibility is that sinners in our midst are the actual way in which we constitute community, which is predicated on the existence of difference. We like to think that our communities are heterogeneous. It makes us feel good about ourselves. In most cases, communities homogenize over time. In the context of a religious community, preserving a commitment of the legitimacy of people who don't abide by the religious norms of a community is a means of sustaining heterogeneity as something that we imagine to be valuable. In this context, take a look at source on pages 7 and 8, sources 3a, b, c, in this remarkable little midrashic treatment about the Ketoret. In Exodus 30, Shemot Lamed, Vayomer Adonai al Moshe, Kach lecha samim, nataf u'shchel v'chal bona, samim u'levena zakah. Take this random collection of herbs, right, stacked, I don't know how to pronounce any of these words, onycha, galbanum. Take these herbs together with pure frankincense. Let there be an equal part of each. This is one of the pieces of religious performance in the Torah that is basically incomprehensible and inaccessible to people of Western religious traditions, but you can actually witness it in the context of Eastern religious traditions, the incense, the way in which smell and the way in which odor and the use of light and even taste informed for so long and continue what it means to constitute a religious experience. And for Yom Kippur, this is critical because the great act of sacrifice on Yom Kippur is, of course, bringing the incense into the Holy of Holies and using the incense, the smell of the incense, to purify the Holy of Holies. So, I mean, it's a random verse in Exodus 30, and if you don't know anything about herbs or about the recipe of the Ketoret, these words are basically meaningless to you. But Chazal do know something about these herbs. And this wild Gemara in Kritut says as follows: Amar Rav Chana bar Bizna, Amar Shimon Chasida, Kol ta'anit she'ein ba mi poshei Yisrael eina ta'anit. Any fast that doesn't include in its fast the sinners of Israel, that people who are sinners have to be part of the community that's fasting, doesn't count as a fast. Well, this is really useful because we're now talking both about incense and fast days, and so Yom Kippur is right in the middle of that Venn diagram. And why? How do we know? What's the precipitating teaching? Sheharei chelbona recha ra'a. Chelbona has a terrible smell. Hakatuv im simanei hakatoret. And the Torah nevertheless includes something that smells bad in the context of an incense sacrifice that was supposed to make the community smell good. Rashi goes even further, knowing this Gemara in Kritut and commenting on the line in Exodus, saying, Chelbona, bosem sherecho ra, this bad-smelling spice, V'korin l'galbona u'menakatu ben simanakatoret lamdenu, to teach us, in case it wasn't obvious, shelo yakel beinenu l'tzaref imanu ba'agudot ta'aniotenu u'tfilotenu et poshei Yisrael sheyehu nimanin imanu. Not just that they're there, but that they're actually counted as part of this religious community. Your instinct might be, and here's the Gemara and Rashi know the same instinct. If the idea of the community is to be good smelling, to perform a religious ritual together in a way that will be a sweet-smelling savor before the Lord, that will actually result in the good that we want, right? You know, what's better than a community that loves singing when everything sounds great? When you all have great sinners. And how many of you have struggled with, you're trying to build like a musical culture, and you have like the off-key guy? Well, that's one of the things that the Gemara is suggesting is like, nope. You think that the commodity of religious performance is about the sensory experience. It would be much better if it all smelled great. It would be much better if the off-key guy wasn't trying to harmonize, because then it doesn't sound good to everybody, and that's like ruining our religious experience. And there's something remarkable of the Gemara focusing on what is a religious experience. It's actually that which incorporates that which smells bad and that which sounds bad. And in this context, even more than that, there's no such thing as religious community without some difference in it, without some maybe even antinomianism in it, that there are people who are violating the rules of your religious community, and your fast will not be meaningful if they're not part of it also, if they're not failing together with you, that somehow there's something wrong with your religious community. I would go even further. Since there's an anu matirin, we are giving permission, maybe part of what is being demanded here is we have to make sure that this religious experience actually makes demands on us. It's actually, since you're going to have to struggle with, that person shouldn't be in my community, they offend me, they offend my sensibilities, the burden gets placed on you. You have to tolerate, you have to do a really good bit of hard work to tolerate what it means to construct religious community together with people who you find to be, in this context, metaphorically foul-smelling. Their presence actually not only shapes the community, but it shapes your particular religious experience. I think so that's one possibility. One possibility is the reason we say anu matirin lehitpalel im avaryanim is because community needs avaryanim. It makes huge demands on us, it obligates us, and it suggests to us that our religious communities are not supposed to be made up by the homogeneity of what smells sweet and what sounds great, and by everybody being equally pious, but real deep religious community is constituted with and through difference. I think there's a second possibility as well, which is also that that there are people who are avaryanim, they are absolutely sinners, but that maybe avaryanim help us get access to those pieces of our own moral failures that we can't even see. To do this, I want to study this wild Gemara in the Yerushalmi Ta'anit. It's a translation by Jeff Rubinstein in his book Rabbinic Stories, who says as follows. I'm going to read in English because it's Yerushalmi Aramaic, so it's not worth fighting through it. It appeared to Rabbi Abahu in a dream. Rabbi Abahu sees in a dream that this guy named Pantokakos, which in Greek means Mr. Completely Evil, should pray so that rain should come down. In other words, here's the pious person says, I need to pray for rain. And he learns that actually, no, his prayers for rain will be less effective than Mr. Completely Evil. I imagine Mr. Completely Evil looks like one of those guys, you know those books, like Mr. Smiley? You know what I'm talking about? So like those circle heads? Yes, I'm getting some nods from the camera guy. Like that smiley guy, so like Mr. Completely Evil is that guy, but like he's like has rage or something. So this is Mr. Completely Evil has to be the one who prays. Rabbi Abahu sent and had him brought before him. He said, what's your profession? He said, I commit 5 sins every day. Consistent. I sweep the theater. I hire out prostitutes. I carry their prostitutes' garments to the baths. I clap and dance before them. And I clash the cymbals before them. When we were learning this text together, it was suggested he's a pimp. I don't think he's a pimp. I think he's actually a prostitutional custodian. Right? He does the dirty work to make possible the business of prostitution. And all of his 5 sins are predicated on the sex trade. He said to him, what good deed have you done? So there must be something that you've done that is sending me to you. He said to him, one day when I was sweeping the theater, a certain woman entered. She stood behind a column, posing as a prostitute, and wept. I said to her, what's the matter? She said, my husband is incarcerated, and I want to see what I can do to free him. I sold my bed and bedding and gave her its cost, and I said to her, this is for you, free your husband, and do not sin. In other words, the story imagines that a woman comes in who's actually, who is not, it seems to be otherwise not a prostitute, but is desperate because of her husband's incarceration, and has come to the point where her only option is to sell her body to become a prostitute. And he, in return, sells his own bedding and frees her from actually being a prostitute. He, Rabbi Abahu, said to him, you are worthy to pray and be answered. A simple way to read what's going on in this text is no one is totally an avaryan. So the reason why we allow avaryanim in, the reason we allow sinners in, is because everybody's got something good that you did. As Rabbi Abahu said, what did you do that was good? What good deed did you do? Ma tivu avadata. You can't be totally bad. The fact that you do a lot of bad doesn't mean that you're totally bad. So one possibility, I think the more limited reading is no one is fully imperfect. I think there's something might be even richer than that, which is what Rabbi Abahu learns is that there is good and bad being negotiated in corners of community that those who are wholly good can't even see. Right? He has to learn from Pantokakos. He knows he's a bad guy, but he has to learn from him what the whole sphere of good and evil actually looks like in Pantokakos' universe. He explains, these are the bad things that I do, but here's where I have the potential to actually do something good. In other words, avaryanim flesh out the moral universe of religious community by giving us vision and access to how religious sincerity and performance can be enacted. If you're in a room of people who are wholly pious, you don't even know the standard and threshold under which they're operating. Maybe it's actually quite easy for them. Doing good when you're not a prostitutional custodian is quite different than when you're actually in that line of work. And so maybe anu matirim lehitpalel avaryanim is we give ourselves the ability to look down into hallways in the process of, and the holiday is all about repentance and about purification. We give ourselves the ability to expand our horizon of vision of what repentance and purification can ultimately look like. The last text I want to look at, and I'll conclude with this, and hopefully it'll be a couple of questions. It's just this short little piece from Agnon's Days of Awe, which just the last piece, which is on page 12 of the sources, which comes from a collection of Kabbalistic writings from a circle in Sfat. Alan Brill has a nice piece online explaining the kind of the provenance of where this comes from the Chemdat Yamim. Contemporary scholarships believe this comes from somewhere between the 16th and the 18th century in Sfat. Chemdat Yamim suggests something that I think we know about our community and about Yom Kippur, but that gets lost in the shuffle, which is, he says, the divisions and cleavages that exist among us are public and well known, for we do not behave like members of one nation, having one tongue as we should. For indeed, do we not all have one Father, and did not one God create us all? Then why are we not united, all the seed of Israel? How much more ought we be one, dwelling as we do in the lands of our foes, literally like one lamb among thousands and tens of thousands of wolves? It's not enough that all the other people hate us. Why should we hate one another too? I am struck by this because the reason Agno is bringing this is in the context of a series of texts talking about the well-known Yom Kippur does not atone for the iniquities and transgressions that take place between people, only between people and God. And therefore, there's this emphasis on the way in which we must see and take care of others. The Chemdat Yamim, however, is forcing us to remember that principally it's not just do good things for other people who are in your community, but when did Yom Kippur stop being about the community, about the collective? And here there's a remarkable arc. When you read the book of Leviticus, it's not an individual penitential holiday. It's not about wrapping yourselves in your talit, having a religious experience, seeking forgiveness, whether through God or through your fellow, and ultimately emerging pure on the other end. It is actually entirely a collective act of purification to begin with. Our field of vision on Yom Kippur is not just anu matirin lehitpalel im ha'avaryanim, because we have to tolerate those who are in the community in order for us to have a religious experience. The whole field of vision on Yom Kippur is supposed to be the community itself. If you start from the premise that you need to eliminate the sinners before Yom Kippur, get them out of the way, or account for them because you need to have a religious experience, the premise you have is that Yom Kippur is about starting pure and achieving something religiously. But maybe the religious gain of Yom Kippur is about the acknowledgement of the collective itself and the work you do together in a collective to achieve that purification. And if the entirety of Yom Kippur is about the collective, then the most rational thing you can do at the outset of the holiday is to own the limitations of your collective. This is who we are. This is the group of people who we're going to war together with. Anu matirim lehitpalel avaryanim is like, okay, team, I know we got sinners in here. We're in this together, and over the next 25 hours, we're going to journey together, and maybe we will be able to collectively accomplish something. I've done a few of these webinars before, and I always come back to the same piece, which is how do we make sure that Yom Kippur rehabilitates the ways in which this is not the piety of the private, or maybe that's important too. You still have to do tshuva. You got to, and we do the acts of vidui, which are so individualized, right? Imagine the kind of hunched over, beating your chest, taking responsibility for the things we've done individually, even though the biblical antecedent, and I think you get clues in moments like this of a rabbinic consciousness, is really supposed to be about a collective. And the last thing I'll say is I think for leaders specifically, for rabbis running congregations, your kind of special obligation or special responsibility in the moments like this, the reason anu matirin lehitpalel im avaryanim is quite so significant, is because I think what's being asked of you is an invitation to see the kahal fully in all of its iniquitous glory. To look out into a kahal and say, anu matirin lehitpalel im avaryanim is, okay, team, I see all of you for who you are, and you're part of a community, as if to say, if it wasn't that, it wouldn't quite be the kahal that you could actually lead Yom Kippur with together. So thank you.
Thank you, Yehuda. That was provocative and beautiful. And the flurry of questions which we received, I think, testifies to that. I want to start by asking you about what seems to me to be the next step, which is to say, if I accept the premise that religious community is not religious community without avaryanim, what tools or frameworks for thinking can you offer me for building relationship with people who are avaryanim without shifting them out of that category?
Well, so it's a great question. I think, so maybe there's two different pieces here. One is an avaryan, the same person who's an avaryan today probably doesn't need to be an avaryan indefinitely. And that to the extent that all of us are in our own religious journeys, I don't think the way I'm reading this text doesn't mean that every year that you get up, 2018, Anu Matirli Palim Avaryanim, I have this group of people in mind, and it's the same group of people I have in 2027. So part of it is allowing for, okay, you're an avaryan now. Maybe by the end of Yom Kippur, you've done your tshuva. And one of the tools that we're being asked to deploy in this context is the tool of allow people to be in their process. Like, your job is not, as a religious leader, to always think that what you're supposed to be doing is holding people accountable to their failings and pushing them out of their failings, but actually letting people get to where they need to get to. I think the other way to say it is, what if it is true that there are people in our communities who are avaryanim? I think that's where the modern Hebrew actually is very suggestive here, because, and English also, when we use the term, convicted felons, which is a devastating term. It's part of our collective consciousness because it's on job applications. If you were convicted of a crime, you are a criminal for life, and there's a lot of work to be done. And how do we not make that a person's kind of lifelong identity is tied into having committed a crime? But maybe also what we're being asked here is, even if that's the case, even if it's not just a human being on a journey, even if you believe that this person is and was an avaryan, and they are and were because of what they did wrong, you can't actually build religious community without enduring them. In other words, that's the hardest piece of the work. Again, I use this, it's an imperfect analogy, but the woman in the shul who's off key, right? And I've seen this happen in certain communities of should we get that person to stop singing? Because that would reduce the dissonance. I think even if you believe avaryan is an avaryan and that's who they are, that you're supposed to change your conception of religious community to actually be one that has dissonance in it. And I don't know what tool we possibly have in our toolkit other than knowing that that's the case enables us to imagine that community offers us something that is greater than the filter of religious purity. Because religious purity would say, I only can surround myself with the people who kind of comport to the way I act, the way I see it, and that there's something demanding of us to actually stay uncomfortable.
Right, it's about shifting the goal, and then the process looks different.
Yeah, and remaining kind of uncomfortable.
So speaking of discomfort, a number of people made comments or asked questions which all seem to be circling around wanting to push you on the limits of this teaching. Are there some avaryanim with whom we really should not pray? Or maybe another way of flipping it is to ask, can I really feel that I am a pluralist and an Ohev Yisrael if there are certain groups of Jews who I don't think should be a part of Holy Community?
So, okay, I'll tell you, look, this is a big struggle for me. I find that oftentimes whenever you start talking about big tent, pluralistic community, the first instinct, okay, well, where's the red line? Where is the red line? Where's the boundary? I would say two things. The first is, we have to figure out how to be psychologically in a space of thinking about pluralism and big tents as a mode of thinking that's different than the mode of thinking of boundaries. They are totally different orientations by which we think about community. A boundary-based thinking about community says, I can't be comfortable until I establish the red lines. And once I do that, I can tolerate your nonsense about big tents and pluralism because I know that I'm never going to actually become uncomfortable. Whereas a pluralism-based approach says, no, start with that ethos, and don't worry, the red lines will ultimately emerge. And they usually do because people don't want to be part of your community. If you've been very clear about what your values are, not in the boundary setting way, but simply in the performance way, people will, it's very rare that somebody enters into a community and tries to destroy it because it doesn't actually conform to their values. They'll actually predetermine their way out. But all I'm trying to do is point out, I think phenomenologically, they're actually different ethoses. One, an orientation towards pluralism as opposed to an orientation towards boundaries. Let me push a little farther though. If you know exactly that so-and-so is over your red lines, we're not actually, then you can't say the phrase anu matirin lehitpalel avaryanim because you already have established that they're the avaryanim, and you've already said I can't be in community with them. So I think you're fooling yourself, right? If otherwise, you're saying anu matirin lehitpalel avaryanim, but it's only the avaryanim that you've already established that you can tolerate. They're not in your mind avaryanim. I think really the hardest work. And I'm not claiming that this is in any way easy, nor that I'm good at it. I'm just trying to figure out what it means to be obligated by this. The hardest work is that precisely those who you say you think are avaryanim, I think this approach is saying to you, know it, name it, and figure out a way to be in community with those people. That there is some extraordinary religious value that comes from that it's going to stretch your notion of what collective religious experience is. It's going to stretch your conception of what community is supposed to look like. I get why in America today, it's obvious I can't be in community with a person that has these political views. And the way that we exonerate ourselves morally is that we use terminology like existential threat. The reason I can't be with that person is because they're actually a danger to me. That's cheap. The harder thing is to say, no, they're actually not an existential threat to me. I just hate them. I hate what they stand for. I think that they're doing bad things for the world. They're not actually dangerous to me, but by being in their presence, I feel tainted by them, or I feel tainted that they might convince me that I'm right, or that I might feel guilty by association of being in their presence. I don't want to validate them. Those are all the strategies that we do. If we're really going to be pushed by this, the fact that you know that they're avaryanim means that those are the people who are challenging you to try to be humble in that moment and to try to construct a religious community that incorporates them. When I gave, I'm happy for you to respond on this. When I gave the example before of a convicted sex offender in shul, it's pretty bleak, right? I mean, that's a dark example. I understand if somebody says, I can't have this person in my community because they actually constitute a threat to me. The harder work is, what if you know that they don't, but everything about them is odious to you and what they've done, and whether you're capable of still saying anu matirin to ourselves, and maybe there's something even freeing about anu matirin, that in the context of religious community, we actually want to make it possible for them to be there and for us to be there as well.
Right, but it's interesting to notice that you're taking an approach that puts the dagesh on anu matirin, on they're a part of our community, a necessary part of our community, build relationship with them. And yet the continuation of the sentence also makes clear that I'm not trying to take them out of the category. I'm not trying to say that they're not avaryanim. I still understand them as varyanim. So there might be some who would say that's actually insufficiently pluralistic because I'm still labeling them as other and as bad as I incorporate them.
Right. Pluralism can mean either reclassification of difference or it could be the burden of actually having to really live together with people who are different. And now you're right, I'm staying on that second half. This is just about being with them. I think what strengthens the case of why this is actually hard work is because I am using the word lihitpalel. I'm not saying anu matirin, liot beki la'im. But the minute that I say I'm mitpalel with you, we're part of a kahal. Like you're saying amen to my Yehi Shmei Rabbas, right? Like, and we know all sorts of sources about how that's a performance of the same religious obligations together. Once we count ourselves together in a minyan, we're doing something together. Right. So I think it's a big deal to say lihitpalel im avaryanim, even if I still keep them in the category of avaryan.
And in terms of the hugeness of the psychological shift that you're articulating, or the cultural shift from a place of first instinct on boundaries to a place of first instinct on openness, we received, I think, sort of like the deceptively simple and profound question of, can you actually do that work of building pluralism with people who are not themselves committed to pluralism as a religious value? So I wonder how you respond.
Yeah, bad news. Team pluralism is going to be more inclusive of people than team not pluralism, right? And it's actually like super annoying, right? Like why, if I'm creating a broader boundary to include people in my community, and they wouldn't apply the same values to me, wouldn't I just get fatigued of that and stop doing it? But that's why it's the difference between team pluralism and not team pluralism. If it was if otherwise, it wouldn't be pluralism, it would be reciprocity. If I'm willing to include people in my community who are then willing to include me in my community, I'm not really being pluralistic, I'm being reciprocal. I'm actually, in some ways, being driven by self-interest. I will act towards you in a way that you will act towards me. Pluralism is a push beyond self-interest. It's actually a push for I think in this context, it's the trading of one value, which is self-interest, a meaningful value, self-preservation, self-interest, for a different value, which is community. Something is gained out of that. And it is an impossible and painful hill to die on when you say, like, I'm going to try to construct the biggest possible tent. And yeah, there are people who are going to be like, chipping away at the tent poles. And people who are going to do things in the context of that community who I find to be destructive. But I don't know how you can be like really committed to pluralism if not.
Right. In other words, anu matirim lihitpalel im avaryanim has to apply even to people whose avera is rejecting pluralism.
I would think it has to be.
Right, or it's not really.
I would think it'd have to be. I think that's when the Gemara in Kritut says the Tani Israel has to include Poshei Israel, that has to include people who are Poresh Minei Tzibur. We have to figure out how to make them part of a collective that is for our collective benefit, and not go the easy, cheap route of, well, they just don't want to be part of this community and therefore they can't benefit from it. If you really are committed to the biggest, fullest articulation of community, you're going to have to be tolerant of the intolerant.
So you've taken a very strong stance, and the Institute historically has taken a strong pro-pluralism stance. It's a core piece of our work. But we did receive a number of questions that wondered whether you would also be willing to articulate some of the costs of pluralism, in particular costs of loss of focus or loss of shared identity, and whether you feel like pluralism is just a clear good or there are also costs in this dynamic.
Look, I'll give you a very bad analogy. So like the day after the election, 2016 election, there was an op-ed, I think, in the forward which said something to the effect of like, invite a Trump supporter for Shabbat dinner. It's like a weird article for a lot of reasons, including the assumption that all of its readers were not Trump supporters, which is actually not true. In other words, it just assumed that its audience was here. Now, part of what I think is operating and it was hard to read that. I was like, no, I don't. I'm angry, and I feel betrayed, and I think, whatever. Yeah, the idea that I hear the criticism out there that says arguing about pluralism right now in this political and religious environment is an act of losing politically. Of like, no, now's the time to double down. Now's the time to build religious communities with people who agree with us. Now it's time to build political alliances with those who agree with us. And there's all sorts of discourses of the rise of moral purity as part of an engine of social change. You can't win until you get everybody on the same team. I think these are really opposing worldviews, and this is why I go back to Berlin. The you might think, post-World War II, post the rise of fascism and communism, the answer is no, we need doctrinal, dogmatic ideas that are as strong as the fascists and the communists, but ones that are actually morally superior. Berlin is like, no, any doctrinal, dogmatic ideas wind up creating this kind of social violence. And I think the harder work right now is to figure out how to make our religious tradition, which always seems to be going back to this, how do we make our religious tradition speak with a voice about community in ways that, even if they are politically less effective, might be actually religiously and usefully countercultural.
Well, thank you, Yehuda, and thank you to all of the many rabbis and community members who are learning with us today. And I pray that we will all join together in diverse religious community to be blessed with a year of health and with joy and of learning. So, Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.